On the morning of the 14th of September 1856, the house on Meeting Street woke to the sound of keys and breath held tight in an old man's chest. Samuel, the butler, had risen at 5:30, as he always did, to let the night out and the pale Charleston heat in. Curtains were drawn, windows unlatched. The salt from the harbor rode a thin breeze through ironwork that caught the light like a net. At 6, he rapped gently at the judge's study door. No answer. At 6 to 10, he tried again, knuckles grazing lacquer, still silence. By 6:30, he had fetched the spare key from its peg in the pantry and stood a long moment in the threshold, a man at the lip of a ravine. He unlocked the door, and the world changed its shape. The study faced east. Morning had already spilled itself across the Turkish carpet, across a desk scattered with briefs, and a ledger left ajar beneath a pair of spectacles. The air smelled of tobacco and lamp oil, and something sweetly cloying an odor that would later adhere to memory more stubbornly than smoke. On the floor, arranged with an obscene tenderness, lay Mrs. Catherine Grimball, the judge's wife, in the gray silk she had worn to supper. Her hands were folded at her waist, as if for prayer. Beside her, a young man, Isaiah, lay on his side with bare feet, his right hand stretched toward Catherine without quite touching her shoulder. Between them, placed neatly like punctuation, rested an empty laudanum bottle. Samuel did not step forward. He could not. He stood in the doorway, while time drained from him, while the meaning of what he saw refused to resolve into any story he knew how to tell. He found his voice only to send Dinah, the lady's maid, running for the judge. Nathaniel Grimball entered the study in his dressing gown, and the face he wore on the bench, that smooth, grave mask of a man accustomed to measuring grief against the law and finding neither sufficient. He paused, hands trembling once before mastering themselves, and said, "Send for Dr. Huger." Then the sheriff. No one else. When Samuel turned to go, the judge spoke again, so softly the words seemed to belong to the room and not to him at all. "Forgive me, Catherine. God forgive me." By 7:15, Dr. Benjamin Huger arrived, a physician whose skill was rivaled only by his sensitivity to discomfort. He spent 20 minutes in the study, came out pale, conferred with the judge in a murmur, and left, claiming he needed instruments he had not brought. Sheriff Pembroke followed after 8, more politician than lawman, and performed an investigation that amounted to little more than a bow. A few questions asked with eyes averted. A glance at the bodies that saw exactly what the city would prefer to see: murder and shame, neatly braided. The study door was locked again by midday. The coroner, brisk as a clerk, filed a report of 4 lines, and a case closed. Word moved faster than any official notice might have done. By afternoon, the grand homes that faced the Battery were already breathing rumor. Society, so proud of its codes, discovered its appetite for cruelty with a speed that was almost relief. If scandal could be made to explain the deaths, a forbidden intimacy crossing the barred distance between mistress and enslaved man, then the cosmos might remain intact, the social firmament unshaken. Men could go on believing the order of things was not only natural but godly. Women could pretend they did not notice the locked doors and the late visitors and the silences that had settled like dust over certain rooms. In that season, Charleston pretended not to hear itself cracking. Carriages rattled over cobblestone with all the assurance wealth can buy, and piazzas drowsed behind their shutters, but the city lived with its ear tilted toward distant thunder. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had torn the map. The Sumner beating had made fury fashionable. At dinner tables on Trad and Broad, gentlemen defended property as if it were sacrament and spoke of abolitionists as though they were a plague of locusts. Amid this, Judge Grimball, a man born to the comfort of ironed linen and inherited obligations, had cultivated the eccentric habit of fairness. Twice, he had ruled against planters in cases involving cruelty toward the enslaved. Twice, he accepted the social frost that followed. People called him principled when they were admiring, naive when they were not. Catherine, born Rutledge, had learned young how to move through a room without letting it touch her. Grace came easily. Happiness did not. She had buried a daughter at 7 and never quite returned from that grave. Those who truly saw her few, and seldom recognized in her a woman who cultivated kindness in the narrow margins permitted her. She taught Isaiah his letters in a hush and a corner, at first in defiance, later in desperation, as if knowledge might be a rope cast across a river she herself could not cross. Isaiah, 28 that summer, walked with a calm that was not serenity, but vigilance. Literate in a place that made literacy a crime for him, he learned the geometry of glances and doors, which passageway to take, which step to skip, how to answer questions that were not questions at all. His handwriting in the margins of a small Bible was exact, letters marching like well-trained men. He had been brought from the rice fields to the townhouse to tend the judge and the carriage and quiet emergencies. He became, in time, a soul the household depended on and pretended not to depend on. Beside Dinah and Samuel, he would be called to speak in the days that followed. Though what they offered, like all testimony given under the gaze of power, was as notable for what it withheld as for what it risked saying aloud. There had been late visitors to the study. There had been a dinner on Trad Street 4 nights before, where Marcus Vanderhorst, lawyer, neighbor, rival, pressed Nathaniel for comments on a proposed statute that would make teaching enslaved people to read punishable by prison instead of merely by law. The judge had answered with care, redundant, unwise, a sign of weakness masquerading as strength. Vanderhorst's expression had hardened just enough to be noticed. His son Peter, pickled in drink and entitlement, had laughed too loudly. For 3 days after the bodies were found, the house held its breath. Dr. Huger came and went by the kitchen door. Visitors arrived at the front steps in mourning clothes and bright curiosity. Then the coffins were borne away. Catherine was laid beneath proper marble in Magnolia. Isaiah was given to the unmarked end of the cemetery, the part the heat forgets and weeds remember. In the plantation ledger, his death was entered as a loss valued at $1,200. Numbers are quick work. Grief takes longer. On paper, the city made its meaning plain. 47 men affixed their names to a petition demanding the records be sealed, for the sake of decency and public morals, for the sake of the living. A judge obliged them behind a closed door. The coroner wrote no more than his 4 lines. The newspapers printed nothing. Silence thickened into something like fact. But truth does not consent merely because men decline to speak it. The first fracture in the official story arrived weeks later in an envelope addressed to Judge Grimbaugh and intercepted by a clerk anxious to prove himself useful to the wrong person. The letter came from Columbia and from a conscience. James Thornton, assistant to Dr. Huger, who had stood in that east-facing room and quietly counted the hours written in skin, the coolness of Catherine's hands, the lividity in Isaiah's limbs. The bodies had not died together, he wrote. They had not even died close. The letter went to Vanderhorst before it reached its intended reader, and in Vanderhorst's office on Broad Street, an evening meeting assembled around its implications. The men spoke not of murder but of headlines, not of justice but of scandal management. They worried about how the North would paint them, how the abolitionist press would dine on the story. They proposed firming the coroner's narrative, pressuring the doctor, finding and silencing the assistant. When Nathaniel rose and suggested they pursue truth instead, the room regarded him with a mix of pity and warning, like a man who has announced he intends to live without air. He left shaken and at last awake. That night he called Dinah and Samuel to his study and dropped the fictions that governed the house. He asked for everything. The letters Catherine had received without return address and burned upon reading. The strangers who had called late. The way the judge's study had, on 2 nights, hosted Marcus and once that useless boy, Peter, and even, 2 evenings before the deaths, Sheriff Pembroke himself. Dinah said what she dared and what she believed, that Catherine's sadness had edges, but not that kind, that Isaiah was careful, careful, careful. Samuel recited times and names the way a bell tolls the hour. The pattern fell into place with an ugliness that was almost elegant. Months earlier, A plantation to the north, nearly 3,000 acres of profitable land, had slipped into probate after its owner died without an heir. The estate files, shuffled and rewritten, were riddled with irregularities. A consortium Vanderhorst, Pembroke, and other men who believed profit proof of virtue had expected a friendly hand on the scale when the case drifted into Judge Grimball's court. Instead, Nathaniel read and compared and sharpened questions. He noticed signatures that looked like cousins impersonating cousins. He scheduled a hearing for September 30. He refused money. He refused to pretend. Threats arrived, then what men like Vanderhorst called choices. The first decision had been made on September 13, when Catherine sat reading by lamplight and 3 men found the vulnerability in a basement latch. Laudanum can be a mercy in small doses. In the vial they carried, it was a weapon. She died quickly. They waited with her long enough that the clock in her body could not be guessed by dawn. Then they lured Isaiah to the judge's study with a forged note in a familiar hand. He understood at once that he was in danger and fought for the brief, fierce minutes allowed him. When the drug took him, his eyes remained open and questioning, and the man who poured the poison, Peter, never slept well again. They staged what they needed the city to believe, a tableau to confirm every fear and satisfy every prejudice. They placed the empty bottle as if morality could be decanted and its sediment left in glass. They arranged hands and hems. They locked the door from within and lifted the sash to escape into the garden, then secured the window with the casual competence of men who had practiced. Murder disguised as sin. A legal assassination costumed as scandal. It was a brilliant cruelty, because it asked the community to collude in its own comfort. Who, after all, would demand a reinvestigation that required examining a lady's life publicly? Who would untell a tale that fit so snugly around the city's certainties? But even brilliant cruelty leaks. Thornton had seen what time had inscribed on flesh. The chemist's mark on the bottle traced back, under pressure, to a large purchase made in Peter's name. The sheriff's late visit stood like a nail in a clean board. With this and more copies of affidavits, notes, and outline of the consortium's investment scheme, Nathaniel prepared an appeal to the Attorney General for December 1. He made copies. He hid them in separate places. One set interleaved with inert estate ledgers in the courthouse, one entrusted to a colleague he misjudged, another sealed in an iron box within his own foundation. He did not live to deliver them. On the night of November 28, fires bloomed in 3 places at once inside the Meeting Street house. Servants ran for buckets. Flames ran faster. The judge's upstairs study became a kiln for paper and breath. The door was found after, locked from the outside. The key vanished. By morning, the house was an anatomy of ash, and the city shook its head sadly at the hazard of old timber and dry air. Death had not finished its housekeeping. Samuel's heart failed, according to the notice. Dinah disappeared into the long road north, or the longer silence of fear. Peter died in March of an overdose. His father called an accident, and his mother understood as policy. The land case, reassigned, resolved itself quickly and profitably for the consortium. On paper, virtue triumphed. In parlors, the story of what had happened in the judge's study hardened into parable, a caution about boundaries, a balm for prejudice, a lesson that spared the guilty and scourged the dead. Decades passed. Then a workman's pick struck iron in a basement where new beams were going in, and a foreman with a tidy conscience carried a 12-inch box to the Historical Society. The seal yielded with a sound that woke ghosts. Inside, the neat hand of a woman who had not found the courage to speak while her speech could still change anything. Eleanor Vanderhorst, brittle hostess and brittle wife, had written her confession 16 years after the murders and entrusted it to a pastor who buried truth in a foundation because he did not know what else to do with it. 23 pages in a script that steadied itself against shame. How Marcus and Pembroke began planning in January when they realized the judge would not oblige. How Peter's debts made him a leash in his father's hand. How the basement latch gave way to a thin blade. How Catherine's lamp wobbled and did not fall, and how that small rescue undid Peter more than the killing itself. How Isaiah's eyes remained open, how the window fastenings worked, how the fire was plotted later by men brought down from Colombia, professionals who understood simultaneity, how alibis were arranged like place settings, how a mother watched her husband carry a bottle into her son's room and come out flat-eyed with the word mercy in his mouth, how she prayed and did not believe herself heard. Paper is patient. It preserves what marble refuses. The box also held sections of Nathaniel's journal entries that read like a man learning, one page too late, what a system will do to protect itself. He wrote of the paradox that undid him. To prove Catherine's innocence would require exposing her to the city's appetite for suggestion. To preserve her dignity would be to abandon justice. "I cannot serve both," he wrote in a hand that grew harsher as the days shortened. "I choose justice, and so I lose her twice." The discovery did not roar into daylight. The men who opened the box hesitated, weighing truth against the tranquility of families who still dined under portraits of the conspirators. They preserved the documents, cataloged and sealed them again behind a bureaucratic veil. Years later, a graduate student with sharp questions and a tolerance for closed doors insisted on reading what the city preferred not to recall. Her dissertation did what honest history does. It made the tidy story ragged. It showed the mechanism, not the myth. It argued that the Grimball tragedy was not aberration, but blueprint, how a society organized around injustice keeps its own myths polished, by scripting crimes as morality plays, by making the dead perform convenient lessons. Now the house is gone, and in its place stands a law office, with high windows and a discreet plaque. Tour guides pass, and if their groups are in the mood for spice, tell the version that sells: a love that transgressed, a night of laudanum, a locked door. No mention that the lock was theater. No mention that truth had to dig itself out of the foundation. In Magnolia, under the live oaks that outlive all of us, Catherine Stone calls her faithful wife, devoted to duty. Someone, perhaps a brother, perhaps a clerk, chose the inscription on Nathaniel's grave. He loved justice more than life. Those words are a cord knotted under the slab, a private message that only reveals itself when the archive breathes on it. Isaiah has no stone. The weeds keep his plot the way weeds keep everything that is denied marble. If you stand there on a hot afternoon and read all the names you can see, you will find room enough between them for the man who moved through the Meeting Street house with the careful dignity of someone always being watched. This is how power arranges memory. The Vanderhorsts are interred handsomely. Marcus's stone praises service to the law. Eleanor's calls her beloved wife and mother, which was true and not true in the way such phrases are. Peter's dates stand alone, brief as he was. The marble says nothing of eyes that will not let a man sleep. It is not marble's job to accuse. But paper accuses. Paper persists. In the courthouse, there are still ledgers dented by the weight of the iron box. In the archives, the faint salt stain of a summer's humidity on Eleanor's confession. In a university library, a dissertation that will not stop telling the version of the tale that refuses comfort. If you read long enough, a different Charleston surfaces, one where the law's language is a stage direction, and the performance on it is designed to keep certain hands clean. This is the city Nathaniel finally saw. It broke him not because he was fragile, but because he was faithful. And faith, when it is placed in a thing that does not deserve it, will shatter a man cleanly. He chose to proceed anyway, and the fire came for him. If there is mercy in this story, it is not the mercy Marcus named. It is the mercy of survival, that a copy of the truth endured and waited for hands that would open it. It is the mercy of Dinah, running into the long road, and perhaps crossing some border of weather and will. It is the mercy that the dead, once they know you're listening, keep talking. So Charleston keeps its posture, and visitors keep their schedules, and the sea keeps breathing at the edge of the peninsula, and the old live oaks keep their counsel. But in certain rooms, when the late sun slants, and the dust lifts and hangs in the air, the house on Meeting Street remembers the shape of its lost door. If you stand very still, You might hear the click of a key, the hitch in a breath, the rustle of silk, the soft fall of bare feet on a carpet that was not made to be a witness. And under that, quieter but steadier than anything else, the scratch of a pen in a careful hand, writing down what the beautiful city insisted must never be said.